We're in Matthew 18, and we took a little detour last week. I have my Kleenexes ready. You guys know that I cry. We're back in Matthew 18, and we'll get back on track. So we first saw through Matthew how Jesus has been changing things. Jesus has said, I know you've heard that you're not supposed to murder someone, but man, if you're raging at someone, you've already murdered them. You've killed off their humanity. You don't even see them as human anymore. There have been many moments like this through the Gospel of Matthew, and we came to one a couple of weeks ago where we looked at the restorative process that goes through Matthew 18, and it's a process that Jesus tells us to take with someone who we believe has lost the enchantment into which all humanity is born. As a child, you're born and you can picture big love, you can picture bigger things in this world, and you're connected to something that is just supernatural. Literally, it's bigger than nature as a child, but life happens to us and it breaks the enchantment. And from Matthew 18, from Jesus' words, we call these people of lost enchantment, we call them lost sheep. Jesus doesn't place blame on the sheep here for getting separated from the divine flock. Jesus says, woe to you who caused this to happen to people. Jesus says that those people who leave what every single human begins born into, they've been tripped up, they've been deceived. We look at the words of what these sheep, and to be led astray, the Greek says it relates to being staggered. It relates to being deceived. And they can no longer, for whatever has happened to them in their life, believe in a good and loving God. And we don't just go on the street corner and hold signs of hate. We don't accost people in their daily lives to simply tell them, I think you're messing up. Jesus says that we speak to someone when we first hold them as a brother and sister. He says, go to your brother and sister and tell them where they've gone astray, where you see they've become disoriented. And so you go to them out of family love. We only get to tell them where we think they've gone wrong when we first loved them right and entered into this family relationship of humanity with them. Many in the church, as we talked about, they say that love is telling the hard truth to someone when they're wrong. They're wrong, I'm right. You're going to hell, I'm not. And out of love, I tell them how incredibly loving my God is, so they should love him, if for no other reason than what they'll do to you if you don't love him. And we talk about how the streets of Tam is born. You can go out there and you can see the people holding signs of damnation. This isn't a healthy way for our relationship with God to start off. And it's no wonder that the church is having a hard go of it these days with the sales pitch that some are giving. Jesus says that if you don't go about it this way, he says if you're going to point out to someone how they might have lost their connection with a God of love, you're limited to those who you love as brothers and sisters. So you've invested in them, you've built family relationship with them, and they feel what love is before you ever begin hard conversations. In the old way of doing things, there was a process for moving towards someone's exclusion because they were a lost sheep. This is exclusion up to the exclusion of being permitted to even live your life on earth anymore. In the old way of doing things, it was a judicial process that contrasts against the family love process of Jesus that seeks inclusion. And sadly, as we've considered, too often the church has retained the judicial process rather than the family process that Jesus gives us. In the old process, from Moses' law, it began with the consideration of, okay, how many stand in an accusation? How many stand against the accused that this is a lost sheep? If only one witness is against them, nothing can be done that moves towards exclusion. If there were 2 or 3 witnesses who believed that the person had left the faith. The person was to be found guilty, expelled from the city. You drag them out the city gates, and then they would be stoned to death, expelled from life itself. The old process was centered on somewhat of this false concept that we've found as somewhat of a facade that they're evil, we're good. We can be good and pure people. If it wasn't for them, the people that are evil, if they weren't here, we would be better. The community's role in this process was to finish off the death penalty. The accusers of the lost sheep, they would throw the first stones. And then the community was to join in and throw stones. The community finished off the rejection of the lost sheep from the community and then from life itself. Jesus' way of doing things said that if there's one person among you who has identified a lost sheep, if there's one person among you who feels led to act out of a brother and sister love, and you're not being a judicial witness to wrongdoing with an end of blame and punishment, Jesus says, there's one that loves. That's enough. Go to them. Go to the lost sheep and talk to them in private. One is enough. And we looked at this whole process over the previous weeks, a process that builds from 1 to 2 or 3, and then it builds to the community, and the community's role in the process of Jesus is to come in at the end with the maximum amount of family love in a process that seeks final reunification rather than final rejection. And if the problem is not resolved with the love of the entire community, if you go through all 3 steps and the problem's not resolved, we considered that it's a singular. If it doesn't work, then the you who started the whole thing, the you who first identified the lost sheep, you treat this lost sheep as a Gentile, as a Pharisee. Which means what? The Gentiles and the Pharisees were still in. They were in Jesus' love. But it was square one of love. And so Jesus says, if this process doesn't work, go back to square one. Go back to simply dining with them, loving them, and move forward with them. It doesn't mean you have to find time for them all the time. You don't have to make room in your life for people who are unhealthy for you. But it doesn't mean that you hate them. It means that you can see them as the worst person, but you still see them as a person. It's a person who, for the sake of being a person, for the sake of the intrinsic value they hold as being created in the image of God that we talked about last week, you still wish the best for them. You wish for them to connect with love itself, even if that can't come from you at times. The rejection of the lost sheep up to death in the old law has been changed by Jesus. It is love, love, love. And if that doesn't work, you start at square one of love, which is you treat them like the Gentiles and the Pharisees, tax collectors, and everybody else that Jesus says, I'm dining with you and I'm trying to include you. The work of inclusion under Jesus never stops. And we considered that the opening of these steps says if your brother or sister sins against you, those words against you aren't in that first verse. This is the process for all of humanity. And Peter gets it. Peter gets what's going on here. Jesus has designed a process in which people never face ultimate rejection. They did in the old way of things, but they don't in Jesus' way. So he tells Jesus, okay, slow down a minute. This never-ending love process is great when I see them over there sinning and I go get over there with them and I interject myself into that. But what about when they're wronging me? What about when I'm paying the price for their sins? How much do I have to forgive them? How much do I have to love them when it's impacting me? When do I at least get to stone them in my heart? When do I at least get to cut them off from me as being perceived as a human being? Jesus said, you go through this whole process, these 3 steps. He didn't say, and treat them as they're dead. He said, treat them as in they're back at square one and grow through the steps of love again. And so Peter says, I need to know, but what if I'm paying the price? It's to the matter of forgiveness that we're going to turn in our next weeks. Particularly, we're going to consider what is forgiveness. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgive and forget is the adage that many people say, and that's not Christian forgiveness. Oftentimes, we shouldn't forget. If we were to forget things that we have forgiven, to forget them is to no longer be who I am and how they've shaped me and how that memory has brought excellent things into my life. Forgiveness is not having to act as if nothing happened or as if it's all good. It doesn't matter. The power of Jesus' forgiving words on the cross. They didn't discount what happened. They said, Father, forgive them for what is happening. We're acknowledging this, but they don't know what they're doing in it. We're going to explore that more. Forgiveness, and at least Christian forgiveness, what we might call cruciformed forgiveness. Forgiveness that is formed by the cross, the forgiveness that Jesus spoke from the cross, I believe is what makes Christianity different from anything else in this world. And I dare say that the American church in large has lost it. That's why on the whole, we don't seem as the American church much different than any other people, other than being more accusatory than being more forgiving. For the first 300 years of the church, the most used verse for the church for the first 300 years was Jesus saying to love your enemies. Until the church married with Constantine and got into politics. I believe that the church is now known for resembling more the accusatory process of Moses and exclusion and rejection to stand in condemnation of lost sheep than Jesus' process of love and invitation and unity. And if that doesn't work, it's more love and invitation and unity. Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at this powerful thing called forgiveness. There was a soldier I knew. Like you said, it can be heavy. But you can't truly understand the power of forgiveness if you don't look at hard things to forgive. There was a soldier I knew who spoke of their trauma from war, of ending up doing things that you never grew up wanting to do as a child. You never thought you would do it. I had my tissues ready, I knew it. Soldiers often have numerous experiences like this. They never were born thinking they would do the things that they do. And one particular incident that haunted this soldier, who I'm speaking of today, it occurred on a fateful day in Iraq. He was the M249 machine gunner for his squad, and Daniel's not here to say, yes, that. He knows, he served in the Navy, and He knows some of these things I talk about. Okay, there we go. He was the M249 machine gunner, and a machine gun is generally what is considered an area weapon. It's not precise like a sniper rifle. The purpose of a machine gun is to get a lot of bullets going in the same direction in a general vicinity. And when the keys to success on the battlefield is considered and the statistics are taken, a machine gun is critical. In general, the ones who win the battles are the ones who shoot the most bullets. And so having an M249 machine gun that can fire 850 rounds a minute goes a long way in helping your side win. And humans are very good at working out more effective ways to kill each other. We now have reduced to fairly small size guns that can shoot 3,000 to 6,000 rounds a minute. On this fateful day, my friend was carrying the M249 machine gun while on patrol in Baghdad. And suddenly they came under fire. Everybody in the squad sought cover, and my friend, he deployed the bipod for his machine gun, and he lined up his sights in the direction of the people who were shooting at them. And my friend realized that between them and the shooters were people caught in the crossfire. Some had frozen. Others were running in opposite directions because they didn't know which direction to run. And across my friend's lane of fire, zipping past, were vehicles driving down a busy road who had not realized that a gun battle was just starting. My friend hesitated to fire. A machine gun firing in a gun battle is crucial to winning. Without a machine gun firing in an ambush like this, your odds of surviving go down drastically. He hesitated to fire, and his sergeant began to scream and curse at him to open fire. Training kicked in. My friend opened fire. He watched as if he were caught in the middle. Began to fall. He watched as the bullets from his machine gun tore through passing cars. It was a relatively brief exchange of gunfire. It ended when the gunmen fled before they knew the helicopters could come with more firepower. And as the gun battle ended, my friend joined his squad's medic and the rest of the soldiers in attempting to give medical aid to the innocent men, women, children, and a baby. They had been caught by his bullets. In cold clinical language, these people are simply collateral damage. They're the price of what we do. Because that term is easier to hide the hurt behind than to say, this isn't collateral damage. This is an infant in the car seat of a passing car who died because my friend decided to pull the trigger. Years later, my friend still saw their faces in his dreams. And my friend yearned for that thing we're going to begin to explore. He yearned for forgiveness. My friend was not born able to pull the trigger that day. He was not born wanting to pull the trigger that day. Those actions and many others that I, my friend, and other soldiers carried out in the military, you look back on them and you realize they fall far behind the ideal of what we first held as children who were enchanted by the beauty of this world. A baby just figuring out, I have a hand. Never planning to wrap that hand around a machine gun. And of the actions that myself and many other soldiers who can't take back from what we did, My friend simply wanted to hear from the victims of this machine gun that day the words, "We forgive you." The friend wanted forgiveness. There's an amazing book called The Sunflower. In this book called The Sunflower, Simon Wiesenthal, he tells of a story that happened while he was held in a Nazi concentration camp. This was a time when many of his fellow Jews and close friends had lost hope and they had begun to question God as they wasted away in the camps and watched each other die. They also began to question the common human makeup of their Nazi captors. Surely they can't be human to do this to us. Simon experienced his fateful day when he was ordered to go clean up medical waste at the hospital for injured German soldiers. As the group of soldiers are being led to the hospital, they walk past a cemetery for the dead German soldiers. And he says that on each grave there was planted a sunflower, as straight as a soldier on parade. I stared spellbound. The flower heads seemed to absorb the sun's rays like mirrors and draw them down into the darkness of the ground. As my gaze wandered from the sunflower to the grave, suddenly I envied the dead soldiers. Each of them had a sunflower to connect him with the living world, butterflies to visit his grave. For me, there would be no sunflower. I would be buried in a mass grave where corpses would be piled on top of me. No sunflower would ever bring light to my darkness. No butterflies would dance above my dreadful tomb. They continued on to the hospital, and arriving at the hospital, they began to work. And a nurse came up to Simon and asked, "Are you a Jew?" He replied that he was, and she said, "Come with me." She quickly rushed him to the hospital, and she brought him into the room of a 21-year-old Nazi soldier named Carl. Carl was bandaged from head to toe. Only place was given for his nose, his mouth, and his ears. He'd lost his vision. They were bandaged. His eyes were bandaged. Carl had been there for some time. He wasn't healing. Carl sensed that his death was at hand. She brought Simon into the room with Carl, told him to stay there, and she left. Carl asked Simon to come closer and sit on the edge of his bed. He said that speaking too loudly would be strenuous for what little strength he had left. Simon hesitantly sat on the bedside next to this Nazi. Knowing that his end was near, Carl had asked for a Jew to be brought to him because Carl was seeking forgiveness. He needed forgiveness from a Jew because the Jew represented the victims against which Carl had committed his crimes. Carl told Simon, "I must tell you of this horrible deed that I've done. I must tell you because you are a Jew." And Carl grabbed out blindly for Simon's hand and took it. And Carl began to speak to Simon with these words, "I was not born a murderer." And Carl began to tell Simon his story of being pulled first into the Hitler Youth at age 16, where he found camaraderie among the other young men. Carl spoke of his father refusing to speak a word at home out of fear that Carl would report them. His parents no longer speak to him and no longer speak around him. When the war broke out, Carl told Simon that he volunteered for the SS. And as he left the house of his childhood for the last time, His mother wept. And the last words he ever heard his father speak as he walked out the door was, "They're taking her son away from him." In the SS, Carl shared with Simon of the downloads of information that he was given, the pamphlets, the literature, and things to read, and the classes he was given to teach on the subhuman state of their political enemies. Once they'd been indoctrinated, they were released to war. And Carl told Simon of the inhumanness of the war. Yet Carl shared with Simon, no Nazi in his group trusted the others to fully vocalize their doubts. They were convinced that everyone else was right and that they were strong in this and I was the weak one, and they would not vocalize their doubts fully. Carl eventually arrived at a Ukrainian village, and he joined other Nazis in using whips to drive about 150 to 200 Jews into a 3-story house. And once they'd locked him in the house, they set the house on fire. And Carl said, "My God, we heard screams and saw the flames eat their way floor to floor. We had our rifles ready to shoot down anyone who tried to escape that burning hell. The screams from the house were horrible, and dense smoke poured out and choked us. Behind the windows of the second floor, I saw a man with a small child in his arms. His clothes were alight. By his side stood a woman, no doubt the mother of his child. With his free hand, the man covered the child's eyes and then jumped through the window into the street. Seconds later, the mother followed. And from the other windows, more burning bodies leapt. And we shot. Oh God, we shot. Carl's confession went on for hours. Simon endured it in silence. Finally, Carl's confession wrapped up. It wrapped up and Simon remained silent. Simon says, "What could I say? Here was a dying man, a murderer who did not want to be a murderer, but who had been made into a murderer by a murderous ideology. He was confessing his crime to a man who perhaps tomorrow might die at the hands of the same murderers. In his confession, there was true repentance, even though he did not admit it in so many words. It wasn't necessary for him to admit it. For the way he spoke and the fact that he spoke to me was hard proof of his repentance." In the silence, Carl continued, "I'm left here with my guilt. In the last hours of my life, you are with me. I don't even know who you are. I only know that you are a Jew. And that's enough. I know what I have told you is terrible. In the long nights while I've been waiting for death, time and again, I have longed to talk about this to a Jew and to beg forgiveness from him. Only I didn't know whether there were even any Jews left. I know that what I am asking is almost too much for you. But without your answer of forgiveness, I cannot die in peace." Carl released his hold on Simon And Simon said he put his hands together in a begging position. He begged for peace. And then silence fell on the room. Carl's request for forgiveness hung in the air. And without a word, Simon left the room. Carl died that night, while Simon survived 2 more years to see the end of the Holocaust. 89 members of Carl's family did not make it through. His encounter with Carl had never left him. And after the war, Simon sought out Carl's mother. He said he didn't know why. He came to her house and she invited him in, not knowing who he was. And during that conversation, Carl's mother remarked on what a good boy Carl was. He was. She spoke of the horrible things she had heard that the SS had done, but she knew her boy was too good to have participated in those. My Carl could not have done those things. Carl wasn't like that. And Simon again remained silent in kindness. He would not take from this grieving mother the picture of her good son. I kept silent when I was next to a young Nazi on his deathbed, begging me to be his confessor. And later I met his mother and I again kept silent rather than shatter her illusions about her dead son's inherent goodness. And how many bystanders kept silent as I watched Jewish men, women, and children being led to the slaughterhouses of Europe. There are many kinds of silence. Ought I to have forgiven Carl? Was my silence at the bedside of the dying Nazi right or wrong? This is a profound moral question that challenges the conscience of the reader of this episode just as much as it once challenged my heart and mind. The crux of the matter is, of course, the question of forgiveness. Forgetting is something that time alone takes care of. But forgiveness is an act of volition. And only the sufferer is qualified to make the decision. You who have read this sad and tragic episode in my life can mentally change places with me and ask yourself the critical question. What would I have done at Carl's bedside?